This is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert, and this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our future. And today I want to discuss why some of the suburbs we know today will look completely different in 20 years' time. First, I want to explore with Simon how the urban fringes of today are poised to be the middle suburbs of tomorrow. But then I want to turn the attention to the challenge of NIMBYism, not in my backyard syndrome. Simon, you wrote about both these topics in your regular columns in the Australian newspaper.
Yeah, and there's lots to discuss here because some of the big population shifts are very predictable in their geography. And then we can very much understand what the suburbs will look like in the future, which is important for anyone providing services in those suburbs and anyone who might want to play the property investing game, understanding what kind of suburbs, what kind of regions might be in high demand.
Well, in previous episodes of Demographics Decoded, we discussed Australia's business model. We discussed that immigration is going to continue no matter what the politicians are telling us at the moment. So I'd like to just maybe recap that a little bit so those who haven't listened to previous shows understand where you're coming from, and then we'll expand on that. But if you haven't listened to previous shows, wherever you're listening to this or watching this, just stop for a second, subscribe so that weekly you get the information from Simon and myself. But Simon, you've based a lot of your discussions in the past on the huge immigration intake we're going to need over the next few decades that's going to create huge urban planning challenges. You've basically explained our business model in Australia relies on us making money by selling mining and agricultural products to the world, by bringing foreigners into our country who pay for university degrees, who are going to consume tourism. And this all requires people in Australia to drill, to harvest, to educate, to entertain. These jobs can't be done outside the country, but where are all these people going to live?
Exactly. So the basic understanding is migration continues, as you mentioned, because we can't outsource our economy. Our economy, all jobs need to be done in Australia, compared to a Japanese model, where the Japanese just build factories outside of the country, they use foreign labor outside of the country, and they re-import the profits. Doesn't work with mining, doesn't work with agriculture or tourism. Makes sense. And so you go, okay, so we'll get people into Australia. Assuming we continue to be an attractive destination for people to come, we'll get people. We'll get international students, we'll get skilled migrants. These new people, when they come to Australia, they know nothing about the country. They only know their university address, their place of work address. And so they all move, because those things tend to be clustered in the inner city in Australia. They tend to move to an inner suburb, to the center of town. And so we constantly get new talent, new people moving into the inner city. That's fine. So that drives up density, drives up demand for housing in the inner city. And there's always a massive turnover of population. People in Australia do not tend to live in the CBD for a long time. But there's more people because we grow the country, because we grow our unis and we grow the workforce. But after you spend a couple of years in the inner city, you start bit by bit behaving like everyone else on the housing market, and you then segregate based on your socioeconomic standing. Which leads us to the existing Australians. Where will they settle? At the moment, our cities have a very big New York City style inner city, high density skyscrapers. And you move outside of the CBD and it is separate homes. We have the missing middle in Australia. We have freestanding separate homes 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers out of the CBD, which is comical if compared to European cities. But that's how our cities grew historically. And now the people that live in those houses, they are great NIMBYs. They love the low population density lifestyle close to the amenities of inner city. They block development. They are the big NIMBYs of the country. So what did we have to do? We needed to continue to sprawl because we couldn't densify the middle suburbs. So we sprawl and sprawl our cities. The biggest sprawling cities tend to be where there are no physical boundaries. This is a Melbourne and Adelaide and Perth. These are cities where there is nothing that really hems in the city. Like Sydney by now hits the Blue Mountains. That's not the case in Melbourne or Perth. You can just grow, expand. And so you end up with a big city. Who is moving to the urban fringe at the moment, or for the next decade and a half? It's millennials. millennials making babies. They live currently still as couples or singles in the inner city, but they're now in a small apartment. But they're now adding their 1.5 babies to the mix, and they therefore need bigger homes. And these homes are only available because of the NIMBYism of the middle suburbs. They're only available on the urban fringe. So bit by bit, we hipsterize the urban fringe with millennials who bring their particular consumer and cafe preferences to the urban fringe as well.
So you're suggesting that those suburbs on the urban fringe are in due course going to be middle ring suburbs. Let's put some context to this. We've got 27.5 million people in Australia, something around that at the moment, and it's taken us not much over 200 years to get to there, but the thought is our population is going to double. We don't know exactly when, but it's actually not that long away, Simon.
No, and my best bet is maybe about 71, 75 years, something in this order of magnitude. We're going to double the Australian population. And that then allows us to play this wonderful thought experiment where you are given a map of Australia with the current 27 million people or thereabouts, and then you get a box with another 27 million Aussies. And you get to pick and choose where you want to put these other 27 million Aussies. And there are different ways of doing this. And it is in the long-term planning for the country. We should be doing this right now to think about where would those next 27 million Aussies be and what are the implications for infrastructure, for new cities, for the growth of the existing cities in the long run. I think I can talk about a couple of ideal ways of how I would want to be seeing this. Who knows whether this will be the actual ways.
Well, are urban planners planning so far ahead, or are they just worried about what's ahead in the short-term future?
Yeah, well, all urban planners at the big capital cities do publish plans maybe 10, 20 years out. But that's only planning. They don't really have the major power to do anything about this. I would, in my thought experiment of planning Australia at twice the population in the mid 2090s, I'd say, well, we could double every city, theoretically. But that's probably not the smartest way of distributing our population, because Melbourne and Sydney stopped functioning at around 4.5 million people in the current setup. So maybe we go, let's give those cities a breather. Let's only grow them by a factor of 1.5. Perth is a functional city. It's a mining city. That doesn't need to double. Even if we massively increase mining, we don't need to double Perth. So times 1.5 will do there as well. That leaves quite a few people that we need to distribute somewhere. So where would Australians want to live? Well, we know that Australians want to hug the coastline, and we know that they want to be close to jobs. That, to me, suggests the eastern seaboard. And so, because we have so many more people left over, it means a city like Newcastle, Wollongong, these are cities that don't need to double. They need to triple. They need to quadruple. And then urban planning in the long term, we're talking about a 70-year plus time horizon, then urban planning gets wild. And some people, of course, in Wollongong or Newcastle might get very scared about this. But we could completely avoid urban planning mistakes that the big cities have done in those new, soon-to-be big cities. The outskirts of Newcastle today would be the middle suburbs of the Newcastle of tomorrow. So that means, what kind of housing should we be building at the outskirts right now? It's medium density housing rather than low density housing. An absolutely bizarre and wild idea. And, we probably don't have the economic model to pull this off at the moment, but that's what we would be doing. We would also be thinking about stuff like, wait a second, we need to move all those people around. So at some point in the future, the current idea of the fast rail network spanning across the eastern seaboard becomes from, not financially viable, which it is probably at the moment, to an absolute must. We just don't know when the transition point would be. So timing, when we build this fast rail corridor across the eastern seaboard, and that'll be the main art. But so if we know it's coming, though, what we should be doing right now, at the very least, is to earmark the corridor for the train line and then do not allow development on top of it. because otherwise we risk to make the same mistakes that Melbourne has done by Melbourne built level crossings across a big fat city a couple of decades ago, and now at the cost of billions upon billions of dollars we are removing those level crossings. It's not the scandal that it's expensive to remove them right now. The scandal is that some moron decades ago didn't have the foresight to build a, back then, dirt cheap bridge over a street and a track and then be done with it. So it is the idea of thinking ahead, what is the most likely scenario, and then make smart decisions for the future right now. Future generations would thank us for it. Will we do it? That remains to be seen.
Well, in previous chats, you explained about Euroblocks, those four-storey medium density developments that have occurred in London and Paris, other areas in Europe, which would be good to be able to build in Australia. In other words, close to the CBD, as you said, there's a few new developments, mainly on main roads where the old shops are being pulled down and we've got apartment towers, but we actually need more of those. It's not happening though, is it?
No, it's not happening, and it makes no sense to build them in Australia, because in order to build a Euroblock, you need to buy 10 adjacent quarter-acre blocks. And people don't die in that of a coordinated fashion that you can just quickly snatch them all up, bulldoze them, and build medium density. You actually need to hold them. It takes a long time to get them. And once you have, why would you stop at medium density? It makes no economic sense to then only build 4 stories. You would then actually say, well, I'd rather build 14 stories, because to make it more financially attractive for the developer and the investors. So the idea of building this, what by dumb luck, remember that those Euroblocks, those 4-story type buildings, we didn't design them with kind of like fantastic urban planning theories. Yeah, 4 stories is human scale. We know this is an ideal density where you can move people easily around. It creates lots of walkable neighborhoods. It was dumb luck. The only reason they ended up that height is that back in the day, by using wooden fire ladders, you could create a gutter line that is 23.5 meters. You couldn't reach higher. So we said, yeah, it's 23.5 meters is the cutoff. Then we created a courtyard in the center of the house of a certain size. Turns out to be actually rather nice. You still had enough air in there. You had enough distance from the different windows. But the size of the courtyard was determined by horse-drawn fire carriages. They needed to go in and they needed to be able to turn around in the thing and move out. So that's where the size emerged. This is dumb luck. It turns out...
I didn't realise that. There's such beautiful buildings when we've been lucky enough to travel around Europe and see them.
Exactly. And so ideally we could take urban planning lessons from those really well-working developments. We could take lessons from Barcelona, who now built super blocks, which is consecutive blocks moved into one super block where you block off the streets and you just create public space in between those streets, and only the cars drive around it, and they can sometimes, if the parking is inside this thing, they can still go through it, but they very much play a second fiddle to pedestrians, so it's very slow moving in the cars. This is urban planning stuff that works, but you can't create this after the fact in a big city like Melbourne or Sydney. That doesn't work. But we could do
The
this.
challenge is also going to be infrastructure, Simon. If you put more people there, there's the hard infrastructure, the sewers and the water. There's also the soft infrastructure. If you've got people there, what about hospitals? What about schools? What about other facilities that people are going to need? Huge problem, huge challenge. Well, I shouldn't say it's a problem. It's a challenge. It can be overcome.
Exactly, it can be overcome, and it's easiest to be overcome if we build out smaller cities rather than bigger cities. And it's very easy to be done in master plan communities if we were to do this very right, but quite often the financial model doesn't work. Quite often just building all this infrastructure comes with a cost while you build it. And that's the problem, is because ultimately if we do what we're doing in Melbourne right now, where we sprawl out a massive city, you create relatively cheap housing to buy and sell at the point of sale. But you do not account for the increasing infrastructure costs by spreading your population over an ever widening canvas. And so you say, oh, whatever, we grow by 100,000 people in Melbourne, we put them further out on the urban fringe, that's fine, but you can't possibly build enough infrastructure there. And this is already the most indebted state in Australia, Victoria, so that doesn't add up anymore. And we're still trying to do the same, and we pretend that none of this is happening. And this is where hyper long-term urban planning would be very, very useful. But I do kind of understand that it is pretty much just a demographer's fantasy at this point in time.
Well, one of the other challenges, of course, is NIMBYism. In your article in The Australian, you identify NIMBYism as a significant barrier to urban development.
Yeah, and we see this if you look at the middle suburbs, the suburbs that are dominated by baby boomers in Australia at the moment. They moved there as the newbies when these were largely outer suburbs, not too attractive suburbs. And baby boomers that have been living in their family home for the last 40 years, they say, when we first moved here, people talked down upon it, and now it is the most desirable, attractive area of my city. These kind of things are common, and things do change as you move, but you don't want them to move to change because you moved into the area, tree-lined streets, very low density, easy to get around in a car. You want this to go on forever, but it is ultimately an unrealistic prospect. But you still block development as much as you can. Australia is also a country where local governments have a lot of power. It took me a while to understand when I moved to Australia in 2008 just how impactful local governments are and how much power they have to block developments. And so that's what you do.
Now, I want to just take a moment out from my session with Simon today to remind you that Simon Kuestenmacher is going to be the keynote speaker at Wealth Retreat on the Gold Coast on the 3rd to the 7th of May. Now, once a year we get together with a small group of already successful business people, entrepreneurs and investors. And Wealth Retreat's not a property seminar. Wealth Retreat is really, the theme of Wealth Retreat is where are you going to be in 2030, in May 2030, in 5 years' time, in all areas of your life. So it's a holistic seminar. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about property and about tax and about finance, and Simon's going to talk about the future. But I suggest that you go to wealthretreat.com.au and find out about it. But please don't count yourself out. The successes we've seen from people who've come to previous Wealth Retreats has been amazing, because you go in with a whole lot of ideas and plans for the next 5 years, but you go out with a structured plan rather than just ideas. And then I always have a one-on-one implementation session with people afterwards to make sure that they implement that plan. But we've got an amazing faculty of property, tax, business, finance, development and demographic faculty, the best faculty I could put together, and it's an intensive 5 days, but everything's included, including a lot of one-on-one time with the experts. But more than that, building a community. A lot of people that are listening to this, watching this, feel that they're a bit isolated. So the aim of Wealth Retreat is to build a community which we help keep together so that you can talk to others about your successes and failures in business, in property, in money, in entrepreneurship. wealthretreat.com.au. I invite you to join us on the Gold Coast in the beginning of May. Are local councils NIMBYs as well, Simon?
Yes, they are. And I don't think there's any malice in it per se, but it's the idea that a council says, well, we are elected officials by the people that live here. And so we are literally in power to defend their interests. And people say, well, do I want to have much more people in my street, which creates more traffic, which creates more nuisance for me? It's like, nah, how about I don't? And so they block development, and anyone who develops housing in Australia tells you endless stories of how even the most successful, most wonderful, most functioning, most affordable projects get cut back. And I always argued that every councillor should always decline every housing development that comes their way. Because somebody will hate it, and councillor, usually at least the neighbor, and councillors are just not incentivized to build, to okay and to change their area. They are incentivized to block development. And bit by bit in Victoria and in New South Wales, the premiers, the state realized that, and they are bit by bit taking power away from local government to block developments. At the moment, we're still at the early stages where we're only using the carrot. We're saying, here's a big new pile of money. If you adhere to your housing targets that we give you, you get additional money from this fund. But soon we will see the stick. We'll see further funding withdrawn from local councils. We will even very much see councils being put under administration because they don't live up to those housing targets. And so far, when I worked with councils that were under administration, meaning a public administrator takes over, the non-elected workers, staff in the council, actually quite enjoy it. They will tell you stuff like, oh my God, I can't believe how much stuff we get done around here. So they are not opposed. And so the state grabs more and more power from local governments. You will see over the coming years endless stories that go something like this in the newspaper. Local council hates the state, hates the premier. Endless story. Easy, very predictable forecast. But ultimately, the state sits at the bigger lever, and we will see the densification of our middle suburbs through planning measures. And at the very least, the middle suburbs will be completely changed as soon as the baby boomers die out of their out of their homes in the middle suburbs.
Well, recently in Victoria, the state government has suggested there are a number of locations which should have more high-rise towers, and they're going to take the planning regulation away from the local council and even away from VCAT, and it's going to go straight to the planning minister to fast-track these things. To an extent in New South Wales, the Minns government similarly started to have a say in where things should be developed and how things should be developed. So what you're suggesting has already started.
Exactly. This has already started. And if I only put my urban planners hat on, you go like, this is a welcome development. So we are densifying our cities. We are increasingly trying to particularly focus on the middle suburbs. And you go like, that is good. That is urban development the way we want it to happen, at least on paper. But then you have the real life, annoying real life figures making an entrance. And if you talk to developers, they will tell you how cheap it is to develop on the outskirts of town. You build a bit of land, you build a relatively cheap box on a relatively small plot of land. You can get away with, what would it be, maybe $4,000 per square meter, something along this weight class, and then developing a square meter of housing in a medium density middle suburb is about 3 times the price. Then the developers go, very pragmatic people, they go, we are happy to build you any medium density dwelling wherever you want, as long as you buy it before I build it. And so they will struggle to find buyers, because who can afford to buy there? It is only the top end of the market. So you have the medium density housing that is currently entering the middle suburbs. That is housing for the top end of the market. Maybe fancy downsizer apartments. Maybe it is super top end entry level housing, meaning lifestyle entry level. So you'd have the fancy young lawyers of Melbourne living Collingwood in an apartment tower or something like this. But this is not a solution for the masses.
That's because the cost of construction, especially multi-stories, anything that involves cranes, anything that involves unions, has gone up 40-50% over the last 5 years since the beginning of COVID, and end values for apartments haven't gone up as much. So in other words, established apartments, it's much cheaper to buy than something new. It's just the stage of the cycle. We've been through this stage before, and eventually established properties are going to have to move up in value to allow the next phase of the property development cycle to occur. I guess that also means that if you buy the right sort of property, what I'd call a family-friendly apartment or a townhouse, you're actually buying below intrinsic value. You can't replace it there. Now, back to the councils, though. You wrote in your article in The Australian that you're thinking that eventually the state government may take away the funding or just even the ability from local councils. And you mentioned something like the Greater London Authority, where they've got much larger say in long-term development.
Exactly. So in Australia, development is handed to 550 local government areas. They have a lot of power. There's, of course, a state planning authority, but they come to nowhere near as impactful of a role as the Greater London Authority. If London wants to build 200 kilometers worth of bike paths, whether it's a good idea or bad idea, doesn't matter, they can do it. In Australia, if you wanted to do the same, these bike paths would cross several local government areas, and each of them would need to be convinced separately and so forth, and this then takes forever. And so there's a lot of stalling. There's very, very slow development in there. So centralizing some of the planning functions would be welcome. And you mentioned it before that this is already happening. This is, you take powers away from VCAT, which are essentially the courts that can give the thumbs up or thumbs down for developments. You push this to the development minister, and you'll give more and more. Essentially, it's the idea you green light more projects automatically in order to increase density, in order to better position new developments near to existing infrastructure. That keeps costs down, and no state should focus more on this than Victoria in Australia, because Victoria is absolutely broke and currently continues to sprawl, therefore currently is at the risk of increasing the annual infrastructure backpack that it carries around, even more in weight, so to speak.
Yes, well, that's showing each time the government runs out of money, they tax property owners, landowners in all sorts of ways. A moment ago, you mentioned that you consult to governments, you consult to industries, to organisations. What does your day-to-day job involve with the demographics group?
Well, the day-to-day job is always around demographic data, trying to understand it, trying to figure out what the world looks like. There are weekly columns, there are weekly podcasts about the topic. But then with our clients, I always, at a conference, I try to understand who the industry is. I try to understand how they make money. I try to understand how they view the world. And then I'm looking at how demographic shifts that we can be reasonably certain about will change things for them. Then quite often in uncertain times, my claim is always that demographics are the closest thing to a crystal ball that we have, that people can then adjust their business practices based on facts. And in my reading, that's a good thing.
Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes to the demographics group. And if you're interested in getting Simon to speak to your company, your organisation, your institution, please get in contact with his team, and he'd love to have a chat with you. Now, Simon, once a week we get together for these Demographics Decoded podcasts. If you have enjoyed the conversation I've had with Simon and you don't currently subscribe, please click on whichever podcast app or video you're watching this, and we'll look forward to being back again same time next week, Simon.
Fantastic. See you next week, Michael.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.